Islam emerged in a world full of influence from other religions. By the time it appeared in the 7th century, stories of prophets like Jesus and stories of other Christian and Jewish figures were deeply familiar across the Middle East. However, instead of copy and pasting these stories whole cloth, Islam reinterpreted them through its own theology. For Christians, Jesus stands at the very center of their faith. But Muslims understand Jesus very, very differently. Here, he's honored as a prophet. The Quran, in fact, has him as one of its most prominent, well developed prophetic figures. Claims of his divinity are rejected. However, understanding this difference can explain both Islam's deep connections to older monotheistic traditions and the theological boundaries it draws between them. At the time of Islam's formation, the Near East was a religiously diverse place, shaped by Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and pre Islamic Arab religious traditions, with Christianity dominating this patchwork of beliefs. Islam emerged within this complex landscape by responding to the beliefs and practices already present. See, along with Judaism and Christianity, Islam is part of a group of traditions known as Abrahamic faiths, which share a common origin in the figure of Abraham, a Hebrew patriarch held in high regard by all three. Abraham's covenant with God formed the foundation of Judaism and later influenced Christianity and Islam, with all three traditions rooted in monotheistic belief. However, Islam sees itself as a restoration of true monotheism. They believe that prophets of the past, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus alike, were sent by God to speak his word, but that word had become corrupted over time, a corruption called tahrif. Muhammad was the last of God's prophets, meant to clarify and restore the true revelation. Within this understanding, Jesus fits quite well into Islam's broader prophetic framework. Both religions share common beliefs about Jesus beyond the fact that he was an important figure. They both posit that he was born from a virgin, performed miracles, had disciples, and will return a second time. In Christianity, however, Jesus is more than a prophet. There he is the Son of God, the second member of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He died crucified on a wooden cross and was resurrected 3 days later to atone for the sins of humanity. But Muslims say he is not divine, nor did he ever claim to be. In Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 116 of the Quran, a scene is described taking place on the Day of Judgment. In it, God questions Jesus about whether he ever asked people to worship him or his mother. Jesus responds by denying this, affirming that he only conveyed what God commanded and emphasizes God's complete knowledge and authority. Jesus proclaimed the oneness of God, called Tawhid, and the truth of previous revelations. The conflation of Jesus and God is rejected so as to conform to Tawhid by Muslims. The concept of the Trinity is also explicitly renounced in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 73, insisting on the absolute oneness of God and warning against any belief that compromises that unity. It states that, although people claimed to have killed Jesus, he was neither killed nor crucified, but only appeared so. This marks an important theological distinction between Islam and Christianity, the divinity of Christ. Islam's engagement with figures like Jesus shows that shared religious stories do not lead to shared theology. While Islam recognizes many of the same prophets as Judaism and Christianity, it understands their meaning through a different theological framework, one centered on absolute monotheism. Jesus, in particular, acts like both a link and a separation. His presence in the Quran reflects Islam's connection to Christianity, while disagreement over his divine status shows a fundamental theological divide between the two religions. He is an excellent example in showing how Islam defines itself. It draws from earlier traditions while reinterpreting them according to its own understanding of God's revelation. Therefore, to understand Islam, we must recognize both the continuity it preserves and its distinction from its fellows.